The law draws borders, sets tariffs, and decides what may pass. But the grape answers only to sun, soil, and time. Across Africa, statute and soil are colliding. When a bottle of wine lands on a shelf in Lilongwe, New York, or Nairobi, it carries more than flavor. It carries trade agreements, it carries tariff schedules, it carries politics. And when those rules shift, entire industries feel it. I'm Untatile, and this is the Gavel and the Grape. This is the podcast where we treat the statute book as seriously as the tasting note. We aren't just talking about terroir or tannins. We're exploring the policies, the politics, and the legal frameworks that decide who gets to trade, who gets blocked, and whose wine reaches the world. Because once a bottle leaves the cellar, it stops being just an agricultural produce. It becomes a legal object. Let's break down the law behind the label. On today's docket, the passport of the bottle. First, we open the case file on South Africa's most valuable export privilege, AGOA, and why its legal design makes African wine vulnerable to American politics. Then, we turn inward to AfCFTA, Africa's bold free trade promise, and the invisible administrative walls quietly slowing wine at the border. And finally, in our verdict vintage, we'll pour a wine whose legal certification acts as its diplomatic passport. So pour yourself a glass and let's decant the law behind the label. There's a saying in trade law: wine is made in the vineyard but sold in the legislation. Once a bottle leaves the cellar, it becomes subject to tariffs, rules of origin, custom procedures, and foreign policy. For South African wine, one statute matters enormously: the African Growth and Opportunity Act, also known as AGOA. Enacted in 2000, AGOA grants duty-free access to thousands of products from eligible sub-Saharan African countries into the United States. For wine exporters, that means avoiding tariffs that would otherwise erode already thin margins. And the stakes are significant. South Africa exports more than half of its wine production. Entire rural communities depend on those export markets remaining open and competitive. But here's the doctrinal truth: AGOA is not a treaty. It is a unilateral preference program under United States domestic law. The distinction matters. Under World Trade Organization rules, particularly the most favored nation principle, countries are generally prohibited from discriminating between trading partners. AGOA exists because it operates under a recognized development exception within the WTO system, not because the United States is legally bound in perpetuity. Which means three things. First, eligibility is assessed unilaterally by the US executive. Second, benefits can be suspended without consent. And lastly, AGOA has an expiration date currently set for the end of 2026. Now pause there. Vineyards operate on 30-year investment cycles. Trade preferences operate on 4-year political cycles. That structural mismatch is not theoretical. In 2019, the United States imposed retaliatory tariffs on European wine, not because of the wine itself, but because of a dispute over aircraft subsidies. Wine was targeted because it is visible, symbolic, and politically painless to punish. And when tariffs rise, buyers do not always absorb the cost. They shift to other countries. For export-heavy industries, even a small tariff increase can erase profit margins and redirect entire supply chains. For South African exporters, AGOA is powerful, but it is fragile. If it lapses, the law of preference gives way to the law of the tariff schedule. If Western markets are politically fragile, the obvious alternative is Africa itself. Enter the African Continental Free Trade Area, also known as AfCFTA. Legally, AfCFTA is monumental. Through its protocol on trade in goods, it promises zero tariffs on 90% of intra-African trade. On paper, that is transformative. But doctrine matters less than execution. The real obstacles are non-tariff barriers. These are not headline-grabbing tariffs. They are administrative friction. And for the wine exporters, that friction has coordinates. Bait Bridge between South Africa and Zimbabwe, Malaba between Kenya and Uganda. These are not just border posts. They are legal choke points. For wine exporters, three regulatory realities matter most. The first being rules of origin. To qualify for zero tariffs, one must satisfy technical origin tests. Proving compliance requires documentation, certification, and time. Secondly, customs harmonization. Many African borders still rely on paper-based systems. Clearance times fluctuate depending on infrastructure and staffing. Lastly, standards and labeling. A label lawful in South Africa may not satisfy regulatory requirements in another African state. At a border, that discrepancy does not trigger negotiation. It triggers detention. For wine, delay is not neutral. Wine hates heat, it hates vibration, it degrades in containers. A shipment stalled for days is not merely delayed, it is damaged. This is why, in some cases, it is cheaper and faster to ship a bottle of South African wine to London than it is to Lagos. But here's where the story widens. In the mid-20th century, Algeria was one of the largest wine exporters in the world. Its vineyards supplied France at scale, forming part of a deeply integrated colonial trade system. After independence, the preferential access to the French market declined sharply. Political realignment and collapsing export demand shrank the industry dramatically. The lesson is stark. When structured market access disappears, agricultural industries can collapse, even when the soil remains perfect. Today, Algeria's wine sector is a fraction of its former size. But AfCFTA introduces something historically unprecedented. For the first time, Africa has a legally designed continental market, not dependent on former colonial preferences, not contingent on foreign legislatures. If implemented effectively, with harmonized customs systems, functioning rules of origin, and reduced administrative friction, AfCFTA could allow African industries to diversify away from volatile external markets and rebuild regional demand. Not just for Africa, not just for Morocco, not just for Algeria, for the continent. But that requires more than ratification. AfCFTA gives legal rights. Rights without administrative capacity struggle to become commercial reality. Trade law rewards not just treaties, but implementation. And implementation determines whether Africa exports raw potential or finished power. So, what does all of this mean for African wine? Modern trade law rewards scale, predictability, and administrative capacity, not necessarily quality or heritage. In the global north, access may be legally mature, but politically unstable. Within Africa, legal ambition exists, but infrastructure and harmonization lag behind. And the consequences ripple outward. Export revenue supports jobs, jobs support rural households, foreign exchange earnings stabilize national economies. Trade law may feel distant, but it determines whether African producers compete or disappear. It influences the price you pay at retail. It shapes whether rural communities survive. It affects whether agricultural economies remain resilient or exposed. Trade law does not ask whether a wine is good. It asks whether it is compliant. And compliance determines survival. And our verdict vintage for episode 2 is Mirlas Merlot. I chose it not only for its pedigree, but for what rests quietly on the neck of the bottle. The wine of origin seal. That small emblem is law made visible. It certifies origin, it guarantees authenticity, it signals compliance. And when that bottle crosses a border, that seal speaks before the wine does. Tasting it, dark plum unfolding on the palate, mulberry layered with graphite, fine, polished tannins that hold structure without shouting. There is weight, but also restraint, confidence, but not excess, like a trade regime that functions well. It is balanced. It knows where it comes from. It travels well. In a world of tariffs and trade disputes, that small marker becomes more than certification. It becomes a passport, proof that law, when stable and predictable, does not restrain movement, it enables it. Because the journey from vineyard to glass is never only agricultural, it is legal. And sometimes the difference between stagnation and circulation is nothing more than a stamp. So, a toast to the passport and to the systems that allow it to move. Thank you for joining me on the Gavel and the Grape. If today's episode added value, please like, subscribe, and comment below. You can find the Gavel and the Grape on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. Full show notes and legal citations are available in the episode description. For our next episode, we have the land question, property transformation, and the law beneath the vine. Until next time, always decant the law behind the label.